Dave's a minicab driver in London, but should manage the promenade without an A to Z.
It's madness, but it's just so enjoyable. It's like a drug, you can't give up. Once you start and you get into it, that's it, you're hooked.
But if you've got a cab, which you drive around London, what do you want wheels on your feet for?
It's more fun. A cab's conventional, boring. This, interesting. But I'm 28. I'm growing old, but I still can't stop skating.
There's no big sign saying, I'm a murderer. They look like me and you. They go shopping. They go to the park. Sometimes they have kids. They have wives, they have partners, they have neighbours. To their neighbours, to their wives and their partners, they're probably the best husband and the best neighbour they've ever seen. They can separate who they are at the time they carry out the attacks from who they are 99% of the time, and that's what you're dealing with.
On this railway footpath at Horsley in Surrey, a piece of nylon cord set in motion the last movements of a 15-year-old schoolgirl.
You know, how could she one day be there on the playing field with us and then the next minute have been brutally murdered?
Single females, late at night, stripped, an item of their clothing is forced into their mouth as a gag.
Nobody knows for certain, but this is very probably the last place where Alison Day was seen alive.
Whoever has done this, there's a degree of pre-planning, of calculation. This guy's not going to stop now, is he? Because people like this don't stop.
Detectives were certain she was the third woman to die at the hands of a sex attacker stalking the railways.
Until they were caught, more people were going to die.
All of our investigation had moved in what was probably the biggest coordinated investigation since the Ripper.
Forensic scientists found traces of his blood on one of his victims.
John Francis Duffy. He was found guilty of the murder of Alison Day, he was found guilty of the murder of Martia Tamboza, but he was found not guilty on the murder of Anne Locke.
There was always something in the back of my head, and many detectives, that John Duffy didn't act alone.
Police knew that they were looking for another man. He was still out there.
The killer has written us a letter.
I was working at Whitemoor in 1997, and I was actually at that time a wing-based psychologist. A prison officer just popped into my office and said, I've got somebody who's experiencing nightmares and wants to see you. The officer said, it's the railway murderer. In that first interview, he so clearly did want to talk. One of the things he expressed that day was that he was very afraid of talking. He was so overwhelmed by the offences he'd committed.
When Duffy is talking to Jenny Cutler, he starts off by saying, I've done some terrible things and I want to clear it off my chest. He then starts going into details of the various offences he has committed.
During that, he was telling me about someone that he'd committed offences with. This is a record. It contains my contemporaneous notes from my interviews with John Duffy at H&P Whitemoor. It was very much teamwork. Everything they ever did was teamwork, even from school days. While he was raping her just under the bridge, a man was walking up the canal pathway on the other side of the canal. They could see him quite clearly. He walked past. If he'd looked over, he would have seen them. He can't remember any decision or debate that this would be a killing.
I knew that John Duffy was speaking to Jenny Cutler. I was excited in some way to think that we might find out what Duffy had done. I wasn't sure what John Duffy's motivation would be about talking to a woman about the sexual crimes he'd committed. I must admit, my cynicism told me, to a certain extent, that John Duffy would take some satisfaction out of doing that. That he could see the horror in someone's face as he told them about his crimes.
We'd been talking for quite a while, and I said, "Oh, which prison is your co-D in?" Which is a sort of prison term for a co-defendant, and you wouldn't expect someone's co-defendant to be in the same prison. And he said, "Well, he's not in prison. He's never been arrested."
And he says during the confession, I wasn't alone with this. I was with my friend, David Mulcahy. They'd been friends since they were 11 years old, and they both started school together. It would appear that Duffy, quite a slight little guy, got picked on by other children. Mulcahy became his sort of guardian angel. They would go up onto Hampstead Heath, which was their playground, and they would jump out on courting couples just to frighten the living daylights out of them.
John Duffy recalled at the age of 9 and 11 a game where they would chase a girl and catch her, and as they got older they would, sort of squeeze her breast. I've never assessed David Mulcahy, but in my experience from working with sexual offenders, I would see that as a reflection of a later sexual preference for rape scenarios.
I always knew there was a person called David Mulcahy who'd never been convicted of the crimes that John Duffy had been convicted of.
Although there was strong suspicions from the original team that Mulcahy was Duffy's partner, there was never any evidence to convict him. In fact, he was never charged.
I would say I was interested to know if he was still offending.
We started to look at Mulcahy, and there was nothing out of the ordinary for him. He was living his life. He'd been working, he was with his wife, they had their house in Hampstead. He was living an ordinary life.
We carried out surveillance on him. Nothing to suspect that anything was untoward, and he was just a normal member of society.
So, running alongside that, Duffy was still undergoing initially his psychological debriefing with Jenny. So we had Duffy's accounts. That was really useful.
I was sending that information on to the police. In those days, you faxed everything, so I was faxing sheets of handwritten notes to the police. John perfectly understood that the work wasn't confidential. John remembers going out in the car with David. David was driving and playing Michael Jackson's Thriller album. David would play this tape when they were going out. It was an unspoken symbol of their agreement for action or offending. It was their trigger. He used to rewind the track Thriller and replay it. It made them both feel aroused. They were buzzing. Their adrenaline was going. They normally just drove to where David's thoughts would take him.
Mulcahy's address was searched. Michael Jackson's Thriller tape was found at his address after all these years. Duffy was saying that one of the cars that they used to go round in was Duffy's Alpha Sud. A photograph was found at his home address of an Alpha Sud as Duffy had explained it.
Well, I know at that point there was like a gasp from us, almost like yes.
I think my views at the time were really clear. If there's a killer and a dangerous person out there, they have to be dealt with. They have to be taken off the street. I was anxious, and I was hearing the information coming back from Duffy. I'm saying, what's he saying? What's he saying? Everything was anxiety driven, really, because the stakes were so high. David Mulcahy is and was a killer, and he was free. So all I could see was a long road ahead.
It was a really difficult, complex case right from the word go.
The way we investigated rapes in the 80s wasn't the way that they would be investigated in the 90s, and investigations in the 90s are probably not how we investigate now. In the 90s, DNA was just coming in.
They are calling it a revolutionary new technique, DNA testing that can individually profile a suspect to 1 in 1,000 million.
Let's assume there's been rigorous contact between individuals. If you can pinpoint that, for example, a strap or a belt being pulled, then you test that, recover material from that, and get DNA profiles from that.
New DNA methods obviously set us off on a huge reinvestigation of the 80s offences. We researched the old inquiry, identified Mulcahy as being the probable second person involved with Duffy. So it was logical that we checked that out.
We looked to see whether any exhibits still existed from the old inquiry, and there was a couple of items of underwear belonging to 2 of the victims, which we submitted to the laboratory for DNA. It was then decided, let's interview Mulcahy as a suspect. He wasn't told that Duffy was implicating him.
He came along, refused to speak during interviews. He had to give a DNA sample, but it was reluctantly given.
He was asked to supply a mouth swab, which he refused, but then pulls a great tuft of hair out of his head and used his words to the effect is, "Will that do?" And it was an act of bravado, as far as I could see, to pull this great tuft of hair out of his head. Mulcahy must have thought, after Duffy was arrested, charged, convicted, it was only a matter of time before he was scooped up. And I think with the passage of time, possibly this explains some of Mulcahy's arrogance. He thought he was beyond reproach. After all this time, nah, they haven't got anything on me. Having supplied the sample, he was released, and the sample was sent off to the laboratory for examination.
John did talk about David's verbal aggression to women. He talked about David threatening women with knives. David was saying, "Keep quiet, I told you not to talk." John raped her. After he'd finished, David gave John the car keys and said, "Get the car, bring it round." John started going and David said, "Take your time about it." David came towards him on the left. David was very excited, his eyes were ablaze. It looked like he was really pumped up.
The more you look at it, I am wholly convinced that the ringleader was Mulcahy, a much stronger character, and Duffy was quite happy to go along with it for the excitement.
During the reinvestigation, I had a phone call from one of the forensic scientists who was looking at the fence for us, and they said, "Hi Andy, I've got some news for you. Can you remember that guy Mulcahy?" "Yeah." He said, "Well, Mulcahy's DNA matches one of the victims from the 1980s. That was on a Tuesday, Wednesday afternoon. Wasn't the phone call I was expecting.
So now we had DNA evidence against Mulcahy, backed up by Duffy confiding his past misdemeanours, naming Mulcahy as his accomplice on the rapes and the murders.
There were quite a lot of high-level meetings taking place between forces. Surrey had a successful conviction of John Duffy. They were anxious about whether John Duffy would try and put something forward that would challenge his own conviction.
It was like trying to climb Everest with a pair of training shoes on. You know, where do you start?
So it would have been much easier if Duffy had just said, you know, he woke up one day and said, "Can I talk to the police officer and I want to confess everything to him." We had Jenny Cutler's notes, but Jenny Cutler is not a police officer, she's not an investigator.
It's a very daunting place, HMP Whitemore. It sits out there in the fens. As you're driving out in this fen country, you see it in the distance, this bleak place. There's nothing for miles. And the next thing, you end up in this secure area. And I remember there being like a little panel in the door, like a porthole, and it was reinforced glass. And seeing this dude looking at us, and it was him. And I thought, oh, there he is. here we go.
So Matt, he had a very difficult job because to work with John Duffy, to me, you're working with a psychopathic killer. To Matt, to a certain extent, he had to work with Duffy on the level that was conversational, that was going to allow Duffy to open up and talk to him.
I mean, I didn't have the closeness that Jenny Cutler did with him because I'm not a female. I'm a big, ugly male, right? And I'm a police officer. The powers that be were asking for matters to be clarified, for him to be more concise, more specific. We all had roles, and he was my role. He responds well to having a buddy. I don't want to label myself as like, oh, I've become Mulcahy, but we had this somewhat of an understanding. It was him and I, you know, against the world.
And he had to listen to be honest, horrific, almost nonchalant accounts by Duffy, who was able to say, yeah, I did all these things.
15-year-old Marty was savagely attacked as she cycled along this footpath yesterday afternoon. Her fully clothed body was found a mile from where the bike was dumped. It had been partially burned.
Tamboza case was particularly difficult. I remember these scene pictures and these woods, you know, it was a very picturesque place in Surrey. It was almost like a cat with a mouse. They were playing with her. The next thing that they're escorting her off into the wooded area. They rape her. And in the end, they batter her to death with a block or a rock, attempted to set her body on fire. And it was just like, you know, this is just vile. All the time, he's telling us this stuff. You know, I'm thinking, there's people like him out there. You just think, oh my God, you know. There were family members that had been victimised by the actions of these two. I wanted them to see justice.
We didn't want Mulcahy to find out about it because he had been quite happily sort of getting on with his life for some years. He obviously thought that it was a done thing. Duffy had gone to prison, he'd escaped any scrutiny, he'd sort of been arrested, he'd been let go.
Time was against us. So every day we woke up thinking, this might be in the press tomorrow if this in some way gets out, that this inquiry's going on. We were really anxious about the media finding out about this, because the consequence of the media finding out would be that they would go live with it.
We go back and arrest Mulcahy. He was very cocky, extremely cocky. He was making no comment to every question that was put to him.
And it's not like on the telly. It's a slog. It's long hours. There's an investigator. All you can do is follow where the investigation takes it.
Do you know the Hampstead area? No comment. Do you know this road in Hampstead where an offence had happened? No comment. The longer the interviews went on, his arrogance came across. And I think in his own mind, he thought he was going to walk out of this. A nasty, nasty piece of work. I asked him if he knew what DNA was. Again, he said no comment. I then informed him that his DNA had been found on an exhibit from a rape that had occurred on Hampstead Heath in the early 80s. He started to gag and choke. He then threw up, which I managed to catch in the wastepaper bin that was in the interview room. I just wish it had been on the tape, quite honestly. It would have been wonderful.
We actually had him in a position where he was telling us about his actions, albeit historical.
It sounds great. You've now got a witness who's telling you, this is what happened, this is what we did, and this is who I was with. But that man is a convicted serial rapist, a convicted murderer. So from our point of view in terms of Duffy as a credible witness, forget it. He wasn't. He really wasn't. During the original investigation, he has openly admitted that he's lied about getting amnesia so that he didn't have to give evidence either to the police or at the court. He's lied at the Old Bailey when he's pleaded not guilty and put victims through a trial. He's been convicted. He's now in prison.
Instead of accepting as gospel everything that Duffy was saying, teams went out. If he had said, I don't know, whatever, team would go out tasked with that specific job. Did that happen? If it didn't, what did happen? Because if we don't discredit him, he could well be discredited in court.
If we could prove that Duffy was lying and still a liar, then he would never be any good as a witness.
Duffy was brought out of custody and taken to scene visits of all the 12 rapes and the 3 murders, and filled in gaps that no one ever knew before. It could only have been him that knew it.
To be horribly specific, he could even tell you about the size of the wall they may have bent a victim over when they raped them. And at a later stage, attended that scene, and that wall, that said wall was there, and that the height of the wall was the height he said, and it was where he said it was. There was one particular one involving 2 Danish au pairs. And they'd been abducted by Mulcahy and Duffy and dragged into bushes in a wooded area there.
Duffy was saying, well, I went over there with one of them and Mulcahy went over there with the other one, etc.
And there's no way on God's earth anyone could have prompted him with this information, intelligence or fact, you know, unless you'd done it yourself.
the two Danish au pairs. Both went back, they got on with their lives. Then, if you can imagine it, out of the blue, they get a phone call from the police in London saying, we've caught someone who we believe is the second person that was involved in the attack.
It's a huge ask to go back to people when they have been through the trauma of actually being raped themselves, because it's not as simple as just telling your story, of course, because you relive it.
We're now opening up this Pandora's box and asking them not only to relive it all, but to actually come to the UK and stand in the witness box at the Central Criminal Court.
They were tremendously brave and courageous in agreeing to come forward and agreeing to help the prosecution.
There was confidence that we could charge Mulcahy with 12 specific rapes and 3 murders.
I was satisfied that we had done everything we feasibly could within the timescales we had given to us. But we still had to get the women along to give evidence. How would they react to seeing Mulcahy all those years on?
Whilst I was relieved we were on the right road all along with David Mulcahy, the journey ahead of us was momentous. It's massive.
It was a very cold winter, a very bleak winter, and I can remember on the first day going to court number 1 at the Old Bailey. The whole atmosphere in that court was electric. It just felt like a lot of people had waited years for this trial.
The first day of trial is always quite important because there had been such a long run up to it, and at times it felt that we were never going to get to trial.
It was the first time a Category A prisoner had given evidence against somebody in those circumstances to bring somebody else to justice. So the stakes were very, very high.
And as I wandered round, my eyes gazed around, I saw this guy sitting there, scribbling. And I assumed he was a court reporter or something, so I just sort of looked away then. It suddenly occurred to me, I thought, well, where's the defendant? And suddenly the penny dropped that was David Mulcahy. That was him. And he just looked so unremarkable.
I had to go to give evidence, and I think I was there for about 3 or 4 days. It's quite scary seeing them there. You think when people do these sorts of things that they're going to, you know, have horns coming out of their heads or, you know, but they don't. They're just ordinary looking people. You know, you'd pass them on the street.
Mulcahy was sitting scribbling on this pad for ages all the time, and then occasionally he'd do this thing. If a particularly damning piece of evidence was coming out in the cross-examination, he would pause and he would look up from his pad and sort of look very intently at what was happening. And then as soon as the person in the witness box gave the answer, he would bolt forward and start scribbling like frantically like this. And the jury would sort of look as if to go, oh, you know, what was that? And it was obviously to give the impression of, well, that was completely wrong and I can prove it.
Duffy told the same story, and he did it in a way that was very calm and cold, probably, which added to the drama because it sort of felt detached. You know, somebody was just telling a story, but the story was of horrific, traumatic crimes. I don't think I've ever experienced anything like it, nor ever will.
I had one goal, and that was conviction, the result. You know, we were going to convict Duffy, and we were going to use Duffy's evidence to convict David Mulcahy. You're there to the very last second with him, you know, till he goes up into the dock, you know, just hoping and praying that he's going to do his bit. It's tough because you just didn't know if he was going to perform.
What was important was Duffy not just revealed the truth about Mulcahy, but he also admitted to other offences which he hadn't been prosecuted for. So that was really important, that not only he admitted that, but he pleaded guilty to those.
When Duffy was spoken to by police officers from day one, he was told in no uncertain terms, no deal can be struck. You are serving life imprisonment, which means life. You will never come out. It's always important because you can then get a cross-allegation, if you like. Yeah, what did the police promise you? How much did they pay you to say what you've said?
It was hard because I didn't know up until the second trial that she'd been raped by Duffy. It was painful, it was shocking. I think I was also hopeful that this would finally be the end. We might finally get a conviction.
The rapes, many of which took place near Hampstead, had been terrible offences which had had a very grave effect on the victims, some of whom gave evidence.
They've been remarkable. I mean, having to come back to court after all this time, 15 years.
I got nothing but praise and admiration for them, for what they did, and the courage that they displayed.
The trial turned out to be one of the longest murder trials, so well over 6 months. All told, it was quite a lengthy process. It is horribly anxious when the announcement comes that the jury have got a verdict and you're all going to court. It is a horrible moment because you just think, I don't know what they are going to come back with.
When the verdicts came in, the atmosphere in that courtroom was extraordinary. I mean, it was so dramatic.
Who knows what goes on in a jury room? And when they came back guilty on all counts, it summed up the whole thing. And everyone was very, very, well, pleased to say the least.
As the judge delivered the sentence, Mulcahy gave no reaction, staring straight ahead. The judge told him these were sadistic killings, and of the two of you, I have no doubt it was you who derived gratification from the act of killing.
And as he walked away, he looked across at two of the victims that were sitting in the public gallery and smirked at them. You know, it was just a last sort of desperate act of sort of intimidation, revenge, whatever. And then he was led away.
In 1986, with the arrest of John Duffy, the police brought about the end of a series of the most horrific rapes and murders this country has ever seen. Today's verdict will ensure David Mulcahy never has the opportunity to terrorise the streets of London again.
In terms of the three murders, obviously we had convictions against Duffy, but for Anne's family, for Lawrence Locke, nobody had ever been convicted of Anne's murder. And to be able to actually convict Mulcahy, I hope was hugely important, to allow them to at least carry life on with the door partially closed.
When the trial judge did his summing up, he thanked me for my work. And the officer that had come with John from Whitemore said, all those little chats paid off. And I think I probably have that as my epitaph on my headstone. All those little chats paid off.
Excitement doesn't come into it. You felt deflated in a way, I suppose. In as much as you think, we've done it. What do we do now? You know, what a way to go out. And that was it, my swan song. This is a letter from Mr. D. Mulcahy, Her Majesty's Prison, Full Sutton. I continue to challenge my conviction for one simple fact. I did not commit these horrific crimes. It's a very simple thing to say, but a very hard one for people to believe me. The mainstay of the evidence against me is from a self-proclaimed liar. He was my friend, and I should have seen what he was, a monster. Yours truthfully, David Mulcahy. There's no remorse in there whatsoever. It's a letter from a convicted killer, a convicted rapist, and these are the words that he would have used back in 1999. He's clutching at straws. He knows what he's done. It's pathetic, really pathetic, and I think it sums up him for what he is, a sad, pathetic person. And where he is at the moment is where he should stay for the rest of his life.
I think as an investigator you feel some sort of gladness. There's satisfaction of a job well done.
It wasn't for glory. I just did my job.
There was tremendous bravery shown by these victims. They put a lot of faith in us. That was something that I felt we needed to live up to. And I hope now that some peace is given to the people who've suffered so badly at the hands of these monsters.
If you or someone you know has been affected by any of the issues raised in tonight's programme, please go to channel5.com/helplines for information and support. Monday at 9, Channel 5 examines the events of Boxing Day 2004 that led to one of the worst natural disasters in history in a brand new 3-part documentary, Tsunami Impact. Next tonight, A&E After Dark.